Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We'll start in about a minute or two. As we wait for others to join us, please feel free to introduce yourself based on your role on an S-STEM grant and your track using the chat feature. Welcome, welcome. It's good to see everyone. Seeing a number of track ones, evaluators and PIs. Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Nina Delas Alas, the Senior Associate at M&A Associates, Inc. M&A is presenting and facilitating today's webinar. This webinar offers tips and insights on evaluating S-STEM grants throughout their project's life cycles. Next slide, please. As you enter the Zoom meeting, please take a moment to introduce yourself using the chat box. Please share your role, whether you're a PI, co-PI, institutional research staff member, researcher, or evaluator. Please include the name of your institution and which track you're in. And if you have any burning questions, please write them in the chat box and we will collate and address them at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Before we dive in, I want to highlight a few housekeeping points. As I said, we'll be using the chat box to collect your questions and respond to them at the end of the presentation. We can also open the microphones for those who prefer to pose their questions orally. There are several visual aids available this webinar. We have a live transcriber handling live closed captioning, and you can also follow along using the links to the slides provided in the chat. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please contact Rachel Stivers at rstivers@AAAS.org. Next slide, please. This material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number DUE 2224093. Any opinions, findings, interpretations, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material are those of its authors and do not represent the views of the AAAS Board of Directors, the Council of AAAS, AAAS membership, or the National Science Foundation. The AAAS S-STEM Rec is promoting consultation with M&A Associates, Inc., as they are a Rec partner. But this does not constitute an endorsement of M&A Associates, Inc. as evaluators by the National Science Foundation. Next slide, please. Although the S-STEM Rec is managed by AAAS, the full team consists of several partner organizations that you see here that work together to advance the Rec's goals. Today's webinar is being facilitated by us, M&A. M&A provides evaluation and research capacity building for the S-STEM community through the Rec. Next slide, please. The, okay. Oh, next slide, please. The REC has a robust resources section in the website. You can access evaluation and research guides and guidebooks, webinars, recordings, and evidence-based repositories by clicking the resources from the menu bar that you see there. Then using the preset filter, select the types of resources you need. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kavita. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nina. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. And also welcome to day one of the FIFA World Cup 2026. Apologies to the soccer fans in advance. I know the timing could not be more competitive. The first match has just begun, I believe, in Mexico, between Mexico and South Africa. And here we are talking about evaluation. So once again, thank you for attending. I promise this will be worth staying for, and I will try to keep the red cards to a minimum. Oops. We'll be out by the fourth quarter, so you can check out the match. So for now, I hope you're not too distracted for the next 30-35 minutes because we have some really good content ahead. So thank you again. So today, I will be walking you through the key framework and practical guidance from our recently released guidebook for NSF S-STEM project evaluations across the project life cycle. It was developed in our role as the evaluation TA providers for the AAAS S-STEM REC, as Nina just mentioned. It was authored by yours truly, with assistance from Nina de las Alas, and is freely available at stemrec.AAAS.org. And I think Tara is going to put the link there as well. So today's format, we have about 15 content slides and about 30-35 minutes. So I will move with intention. One thing to keep in mind, the core thread that is running through today's presentation is effective S-STEM evaluation that begins before the award is made. I cannot emphasize this enough, folks. And it builds progressively as scholars are advancing through the program. Right. So the core thread, again, is that effective S-STEM evaluation begins before the award is made. That means that you're working with your evaluator in the pre-award phase, and it builds progressively as the scholars advance through your project. Next slide, please. So who is this guidebook for? So some of you may have actually scanned through the guidebook, and some of you probably are seeing this for the very first time. So please take a moment to download the guidebook. It's for you all. And essentially, it's for evaluators. It's for the PIs, the co-PIs, project managers, institutional research folks, and social science researchers on all the tracks. So essentially, anyone who is responsible for designing, managing, or improving an S-STEM award should be reading or accessing the guidebook. The most important message on this slide, as I see it, is at the bottom. Effective evaluation begins before the award is made. I've said this already 3 times. So when an evaluator is engaged during the proposal development, evaluation questions align with your logic model, your evidence-based practices, EBPs, I'm going to use that term several times today, and scholar supports from day one. So that early engagement also helps build relationships. It also builds the data infrastructure and the baseline measures that make later summative work very credible. So an S-STEM project that retrofits the evaluation after the funding is always playing catch up. Most of you here who are evaluators would agree that when you're brought on board in year 2, year 3, year 4 of a grant, for whatever reason, it's a lot of catching up to do because your mode of operation is different from the evaluator who left or the project that didn't have an evaluator. So you are catching up, not only trying to understand the project, the goals, the objectives, the activities, but also catching up with data collection, data analysis, reporting, and not to mention the stress. So a project that retrofits evaluation after funding and after the beginning of the project essentially is always playing catch up. Next slide, please. All right. So the evaluation expectations must align with track and phase, right? That's the bottom line here, right? So 3 tracks, 3 starting points. Essentially, the guidebook talks about the 3 tracks, how are they starting, and what are the various things that are overlapping, and sometimes they are concurrent, and sometimes they are sequential in each of the track. So we will be talking about this quite a bit today. So track 1 includes year 0, planning phase, before the scholars are selected, right? So evaluation in that year particularly focuses on readiness, but not outputs or outcomes. Again, track 1 is essentially infrastructure, it's planning, and there are no scholars. So if there are no scholars, you're not evaluating anything that is related to the scholar outputs or outcomes. So essentially, what are you trying to do in track 1? We're going to get there. Then track 2 begins implementation and scholar selection almost immediately. So the moment a track 2 is awarded, we know that they are expected to start the planning, implementation, and scholar selection in the first year itself. So there is a need of immediate implementation. Then track 3. Track 3 does the same, but it also adds a required social science research component that is aimed at generating generalizable knowledge in a very rigorous evidence-based fashion. So the last distinction really matters, that evaluation here is assessing the project effectiveness within your institution, while the generation of knowledge/research examines the mechanisms that generalize beyond it, right? Both are required in track 1 and track 2, and they are to be conducted by the evaluator. But in track 3, a much more evidence-based, rigorous research study is required, and it is conducted by a separate social science researcher. So if you're interested to know more in terms of who does what, when, how, I would suggest that please read our very first guidebook that was released about 2 years ago. And that guidebook was all about differentiating between evaluation, generation of knowledge, and research for track 3. The overriding rule, as we see it, and most of you here will agree, is that evaluation should never outpace implementation. So we've had some instances where the PIs or the co-PIs, whoever is running the show, they are very eager to know in year 2, please tell us what the impact of our work is. The answer is no, we cannot show the impact right away because the evaluation is not outpacing implementation. So the implementation needs to show some results. The implementation needs to be strong. The implementation needs to show the outputs. And that's when the evaluator or the evaluation is going to show the impact or the effectiveness, right? So asking about graduation rates in year 1 is very premature. And at the same time, what is appropriate in year 1 will fundamentally differ from year 4, year 5, and the final year, year 6. So evaluation should never outpace implementation, and asking about graduation rates, retention rates, or transfer rates in the first year itself is premature. And what is appropriate in year 1 is definitely fundamentally different from what we're going to find in years 4, 5, and 6. Okay. Next slide, please. So in this slide, let's look at this diagram, which is the visual core of the guidebook. So if you will walk with me from left to right, you will see year 0, track 1 only is planning and readiness, basically setting the stage. You're setting the foundation, the infrastructure for your S-STEM grant. There is no scholar data collection. Mind you, there is no scholar data collection if you're in year 0, except in the case, well, I'm going to give you an example where an institution already had an S-STEM grant and they're finishing up the previous grant, so there is a bit of a spillover. That's when you're finishing up that grant's outcomes, right? And you're also tracking that cohort, while at the same time, you are collecting information, but that only happens, mind you, in track 2 and track 3. Never in track 1, where the year 0 is planning and readiness. So year 1 then shifts to formative evaluation that kind of focuses on planning, implementation, and onboarding, the second box. So year 2 deepens the examination of very early academic signals, right? Not gains, but signals. Then year 3 is a formal analytic milestone. The first time meaningful trend analysis is kind of possible. Again, depending on your project, depending on your cohorts, the strength of your cohort, and where you are in terms of the selection of your scholars and the programming and the implementation. Then year 4 and 5, they move to intermediate summative work across the multiple cohorts. By now, we are assuming that you would have at least 2 to 3 cohorts already in your project. Year 6 is the final summative, which means that you are literally looking at the impact. You're looking at the graduation, completion, transfer rates, and you're also looking at the STEM attainment, post-graduation pathways, right? Workforce information and data. And very important aspect in year 6 is also the major lessons learned, the promising practices. What really stuck out in this whole project for you, for the PIs, the co-PIs, and everybody involved. Now, in this same image, you will also see the feedback loops at the bottom, right? The feedback loops are critical for any stage of the evaluation process. Keep in mind that feedback loops are not sequential stages. They are a continuous cycle, which means that you're collecting data and you're informing your project team. You're collecting data, you're informing the project team is making corrective actions where necessary, and again, it goes back to the implementation, and again, you're collecting data and feeding back the results to the project team. So it is an iterative process and it is a continuous process. Do not wait, evaluators, do not wait until the end of the year, the grant year, to collect data just once and then report out saying that, oh, well, this didn't work too well now, is it? That's not super helpful to the PI because they're like, if you had told us 5 months before, we would have been able to fix this. So that's why the feedback loop is very critical. It is not in sequential stages. It is a continuous cycle. So the formative data, which is collected early, also becomes the foundation for the later summative conclusions because everything is feeding sequentially into the next phase of your project and the next phase of your evaluation. And the summative findings also do not close the loop. They kind of reopen it because they're telling the story in a continuous fashion. So for instance, if year 3 data analysis and results reveal some kind of an inequity in the outcomes for a particular subgroup of your cohort, this is an opportunity for the team, the project team, the PIs and the co-PIs to make formative corrective adjustments for the next cohort, right? Because the next cohort is probably being recruited or selected in the fall of that year. And these results from that year will actually help to make those corrective actions and make those adjustments to the next cohort. So in our experience evaluating STEM grants across the years, this cycle is cumulative and it generally never really stops. So that's the essence of this particular slide, that, the feedback loop is continuous. It has to happen in a systematic fashion, and it has to be actionable and meaningful for not only the evaluator, but more essentially for the PIs and co-PIs who are running the show. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so most of you already know about formative and summative evaluation, right? So they are distinct purposes, but they happen in separate phases, and sometimes they overlap, right? So the formative evaluation essentially asks very process-oriented questions, right? So to what extent are the scholar selection processes working as designed? There are some examples of formative questions, right? Are the scholars participating in mentoring or in tutoring or any other evidence-based practice that you have in your project? To what extent the early academic supports are reaching those who need them the most? While the summative evaluation really asks outcome and impact related questions, once sufficient evidence has accumulated. For instance, to what extent are scholars persisting at higher rates? Are progression patterns improving? If they are, for whom? Right. So here is what makes STEM pretty distinctive. Because multiple scholar cohorts are active simultaneously, formative and summative work often overlap. In our experience, almost always they overlap. So an evaluator may be presenting summative retention findings for, say, cohort 1, or on an overlapped STEM project, as I mentioned, from earlier years, while simultaneously providing formative feedback on cohort 3 that is to be onboarded or has just onboarded. So let me say this again. So an evaluator may be presenting summative retention findings on, say, cohort 1 or on an overlapped STEM project from earlier years that is finishing up, while simultaneously providing formative feedback on, say, cohort 3's onboarding process. So this is not essentially a complication. I think personally it is a mature evaluation practice to be able to not only collect data that is towards the end of a particular STEM project, but at the same time also collecting formatively on something that is happening or about to happen is something an experienced, a good evaluator should be able to do. So formative data from years 1 and 2 will serve as longitudinal building blocks for all the future summative analysis, and the summative findings will generate new formative questions. Again, going back to the iterative continuous feedback and how the formative and summative evaluations are speaking to each other, informing each other, and they're providing evidence back and forth. So think of both formative and summative evaluation as interlocking aspects of an evaluation and not essentially sequential. I've seen books, I've seen images where it shows a very linear way of doing formative, summative. I think that's just for a visual appeal, but in real life, folks, most of you will agree that it doesn't happen that way. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about evaluation generation of knowledge. Again, a lot of in-depth information with some really good examples are in the first guidebook that was released 2 years ago. So please check it out. And also for the prospective PIs who will probably be applying for the 2027 STEM, there's a lot of information on evaluation versus generation of knowledge and logic model, so on and so forth. So here I'm just going to touch upon this because it relates to how we have put together the guidebook and how it really informs the process of evaluation from year to year. All right. So essentially, evaluation and generation of knowledge are conceptually distinct, yet they're complementary, right? Especially in track 3. So research, again, seeks to generate generalizable knowledge. It examines the mechanisms and the theoretical constructs, such as the evidence-based practices, like EBPs, like STEM identity, sense of belonging or sense of care, financial stress, and produces theory-driven publications and dissemination mechanisms. So a useful example here is that the evaluation essentially documents that scholars in structured mentoring show higher retention rates, right? Research, on the other hand, would then ask, why is this happening? So research is essentially exploring the mediating variables, such as academic confidence or quality of the mentor relationships. So if you notice, it's the same kind of data, but there are different questions, different lines of inquiry, and different unit of analysis and audiences. So evaluation is documenting that scholars in structured mentoring show higher retention, while the generation of knowledge or research asks, why is this happening? So the GOK is exploring the mediating variables, such as academic confidence or the quality of mentor relationships. Same kind of data, different questions. So even when evaluation and research share the same kind of instruments, they must remain analytically separate. Conflating them in annual reports is one of the most common track 3 missteps, right? So some of you may be asking, well, what exactly is a mediating variable, right? So mediating variable is also called a mediator, which explains the process or mechanism through which an independent variable, or IV, influences a dependent variable, DV. So it kind of sits in the causal pathway between cause and effect. So the basic structure is an independent variable leads to a mediating variable, and that leads to a dependent variable. A broad example here is you provide professional development to, say, faculty, right? And the faculty show instructional confidence. That is the mediator. And that in turn potentially leads to scholar achievement. So the IV is a professional development, mediator is the instructional confidence of the faculty members, and the dependent variable is a scholar achievement. Right? So that's how we kind of measure the generation of knowledge as opposed to evaluation. All right, next step, next slide, please. Okay, so let's put this a little bit more structure in terms of what does it look like evaluation-wise in year 0 or track 1, right? Again, track 1 has year 0, mostly planning and readiness. There are no scholars yet, and the evaluation essentially focuses entirely on the design integrating. So let's dig deeper. Keep in mind, there are no scholars and no outputs or outcomes to measure. But what happens here sets the stage, the foundation for everything that follows in years 2 onwards. Your S-STEM project is refining the eligibility criteria of the scholars, it's redesigning the selection procedures, clarifying disbursement procedures, establishing relationships, even establishing cross-unit coordination in year 0 for track 1. The evaluator, on the other hand, is simultaneously finalizing the evaluation plan, the logic model. Important thing is they're also completing the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, the forms. They're also developing tools and instruments, and they're checking out the most appropriate EBPs, evidence-based practices that will be most appropriate for their project. As I already mentioned, they're also aligning the logic model to measure the indicators. They're collecting baseline institutional STEM data. Because by the time the proposal actually was written and awarded and it actually takes off, there is a lag. So maybe you want to collect some baseline information as to how have the numbers changed, or if they have not, what does it look like, so that you have some kind of a foundation or baseline. And they're also building essentially the data collection tools. And these tools generally are surveys, some assessment tools. And in track 1 and track 2, since you're also doing the generation of knowledge, you are also collecting very specific validated scales for the EBPs that you have proposed. Right? So that baseline STEM data collection is critical for year 0. In my opinion, without it, you really cannot make credible comparisons to non-scholarship STEM students later. Essentially, if you have a comparison group and you have enough budget to run some more rigorous analysis, I think you definitely want to have that information so that you can make credible comparisons to non-scholarship STEM students. At the same time, year 0 is also essential for reporting. But what do you write in a report? It doesn't have to be a 15-20 page report because you won't have data as much. However, it could be a 5 to 7, 8 pages memo, which outlines the baseline scholar profile, who will be recruited and selected the following year. What was the planning like? What kind of instruments did you develop? What are some of the validation scales that you used? And then what is your process moving forward in terms of being an evaluator for the next subsequent years? So year 0 is also an intensive collaboration period between the evaluator and the PI co-PI team. I would suggest that schedule some periodic or even regular planning meetings, because you get to know what is being planned, what will be implemented. And if you have enough experience in STEM grants, you can actually provide some really good guidance as to, well, let's not rush into bringing in 25 scholars in the first year. Let's phase them out. Let's see what works, right? How do you want to disperse the money? How will you work with the financial aid office? How will you work with the institutional research people to collect the data? So this is the time to establish that relationship with the PI, the co-PI, any faculty mentors, get to understand what their plan of implementation is in the subsequent years. So that, in a sense, is year 0 for track 1. Next slide, please. Now let's look into years 1 and 2, which I already mentioned is primarily formative. So in years 1 and 2, as an evaluator, you are laying the groundwork for all the future summative analysis. Years 1 and 2 are intensive. The project launches the scholar selection, scholarships are given out, mentoring process begins, cohort activities begin, and the academic support systems are all in close succession. Many things are happening at the same time. On the evaluation side, this phase is primarily formative. You are monitoring the selection transparency and demographic reach. You're also tracking the mentoring dosage, how often, right? Who is providing the mentoring? What is the quality of the mentoring? Are you collecting any mentoring logs? You're also collecting scholar feedback on some EBPs such as sense of belonging, financial stability, while also examining their very preliminary or early academic indicators, courses taken, GPAs, credit accumulation, and also term-to-term retention. At the same time, you're also watching for early risk signals like withdrawal patterns or low support engagement. Right? So this is what primarily happens in years 1 and 2. Formative, right? So you're setting the stage, you're collecting some monitoring data on the EBPs, financial stability, some early academic indicators, GPA, retention, and also short formative memos that should go with recommendations, lessons learned. Remember, you're also providing feedback. So one of the critical insights here is that formative data that is collected here are not temporary snapshots. they are essentially longitudinal building blocks. As I mentioned, they are building towards your summative evaluation, which is your impact, your effectiveness of that project. So by the end of year 2, what happens is the year 1 GPA distribution becomes the baseline for year 3 persistence analysis. The participation records become explanatory variables in the later outcome models. The survey trend lines on belonging and financial stress also become the basis for tracking change. And when year 3 midpoint summative evaluation or analysis begins, its credibility heavily depends on the integrity of what data was collected in years 1 and 2. So you see here the dependency. What you collect in year 1 and 2 becomes a very strong foundation for the subsequent years. So personally, I treat years 1 and 2 data collection with the same rigor that you would apply to the subsequent years, 3, 4, 5, sometimes even more, because you need to have a very, very strong baseline and foundation data. As I mentioned, what would be the nature of those formative evaluation reports? It would be very short data summaries. It has to be a couple of pages, right? A few bullet points as to what you found. And that could be made probably each semester, once at the end of fall, beginning of winter, and once at the end of spring. It doesn't have to be a full-fledged memo. Again, this is not to be confused with the evaluation report that you have to write. And this evaluation report is generally much bigger, like 15, 20, 25 pages, depending on how you write and how much data you have. So the memo essentially is more actionable because it is providing feedback, it is providing lessons learned and recommendations, and goes into the process of continuous feedback system back to the project team. Next slide. So here we are talking about the midpoint summative, right? This is essentially the first point at which some real meaningful trend analysis becomes possible, depending on the quality of data. So year 3 is a formal analytical milestone. At least one cohort now has 2 or more years of data. You're making some genuine midpoint summative analysis possible at this time, hopefully, and the evaluation question shifts from are we implementing as intended to are our supports producing measurable academic progress? Are we implementing as needed to are our supports producing measurable academic progress? So you see the shift. Typical activities include retention rate analysis, academic progression tracking, cross-cohort comparisons wherever it's feasible, and also subgroup analysis. You also want to be able to see transfer versus first time in college, first gen, and other groups. For track 3 projects, this often coincides with the mid-grant review, making emerging evidence of outcomes especially important. Now, your question might be like, what could be the formal kind of deliverable at this point? So the formal deliverable is a midpoint evaluation report that feeds directly into the NSF annual reporting and strategic planning. And here is the formative summative overlap in action, right? Here, while you're presenting the year 3 summative retention findings from cohort 1, as I mentioned, you may simultaneously be providing formative feedback on cohort 3's onboarding. So here's where the magic happens essentially in year 3. So if midpoint results surface a subgroup analysis, say transfer scholars persisting at, say, lower rates, then the PI team can respond with some targeted advising mechanisms immediately. So the summative evidence really becomes the catalyst for a new formative action, going back to what I was talking about, continuous feedback. Next slide, please. All right, so as evaluators, we have often come across small samples, and this is very, very true for STEM projects. So we have a guidebook for that. I'm glad you asked, or you didn't, but we have a guidebook which has exercises and it has worked samples, folks. So check it out, and you will see that we have actually worked out the solution for you. So going back to the issue of how do we deal with small sample sizes. So S-STEM cohorts are typically 10 to 25 scholars. In some of my projects, they are actually much fewer than that. So the traditional significant testing was generally designed for larger samples. We know that. And they may actually miss practically meaningful differences. So two approaches are particularly suited here. First is the Hedges G, a small sample adjustment that is related to Cohen's D. And this is very much useful for our S-STEM projects. Right. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the overall, and an example that you'll find in the guidebook is that an overall retention rate of 88% can mask a 75% rate for transfer scholars versus 92% for first time in college students. So that 17% gap signals where the targeted advising, mentoring, or any other EBP are needed. But with smaller cohorts, prioritizing the descriptive trends and looking at the context interpretation is really critical. And that kind of really trumps over the statistical significance. So the goal here is to identify some meaningful patterns that will help inform the refinement and not just producing publishable p-values. So I would deeply encourage and recommend that you take a look at this guidebook. It has worked examples and it also has a worksheet. So you can just, play around, download the worksheet, which is an Excel file, move around the numbers. I mean, put in your own numbers and you will actually get the results, folks. So please, please check it out. Next slide. All right, now we are on to years 4 and 5. So from here, we are moving from monitoring components to actually analyzing the ecosystem of supports that are provided to the scholars. So by years 4 and 5, the analytic question generally shifts from monitoring individual components to actually understanding how the full ecosystem of support functions together for the S-STEM scholars, right? So we have the cross-cohort retention comparisons, we have multi-year trend analysis, we also have engagement outcome linkage to make sure things work. Does mentoring, dosage, or research participation predict persistence? That's one question. And cumulative scholarship impact analysis all become possible and appropriate in years 4 and 5. Again, building on a very, very strong foundation in years 1, 2, and 3. The thematic briefs also examine the EBPs, evidence-based practices. They are also particularly useful in years 4 and 5. For example, you may want to investigate, do scholars with at least 2 semesters of structured mentoring show higher persistence or GPA gains than those with lower engagement? That's a great question to investigate. So this is also when the institutional leaders and the project team members start asking the right questions. What practices demonstrate consistent impact or effectiveness, which require disproportionate effort related to the outcomes? What is ready for institutionalization? What do we keep? What do we change? What do we get rid of? What are those fundamental changes that we need to make in years 4 and 5? At the same time, folks, we also should be thinking about sustainability. Sustainability planning should begin here, if you haven't already, not in year 6. Teams that wait until the last year make institutionalization decisions under pressure, with no time to implement them. And even at this stage, the formative feedback loops remain active. The summative findings should directly and consistently trigger targeted refinements. Right? So that's what happens in years 4 and 5. Moving on to the next slide, please. Final summative. This is the culmination, synthesis, and institutionalization planning. So year 6 is both culminating and a huge transition year. The evaluator shifts from monitoring to comprehensive synthesis across all cohorts. 4 areas of final analysis are degree completion and time to degree. STEM attainment. Did scholars complete the degrees in STEM disciplines, which were aligned with the project scope? What is the cumulative impact assessment? How scholarships and your EBPs collectively have contributed to persistence, attainment, and post-graduation pathways and workforce pathways. The final deliverables in Year 6 include a comprehensive evaluation report, which has an executive summary for institutional leadership that emphasizes the return on investment, lessons learned, recommendations, and sustainability guidance. So critically, Year 6 reporting is not just retrospective. It is a bridge to institutionalization. The project's legacy is shaped not just by graduation or retention numbers, but by which mentoring structures, advising protocols, and cohort models get embedded in the department. So this is also the institutionalization process, right? Next slide, please. I know I'm rushing a little bit because we are almost close to the end, and I want to leave some time for questions. So feedback loops in practice, right? We already talked about this a lot. So evaluation findings, again, should not sit in a shared drive. The 4-step cycle on this slide really is data collection, analysis, interpretation, reporting and discussion, action, and refinement. They should record throughout the project and not just the annual reporting time. So in practice, generally what we do is we share a brief 1 to 2 page evaluation memo after each semester, or once a quarter, depending on how the activities have been done. We also review any data dashboard data in the monthly PI meetings, and we help to translate the findings into specific action steps. So that documentation, I believe, is very important because it matters. When NSF asks how evaluation-informed project improvement happened, you want a clear evidence of all that happened and all that evidence that entails, right? Also notice that feedback loops are semester-based and they're not annual. And the project that not only discusses the evaluation findings at the annual reporting time is missing the adaptive power of formative evaluation entirely. So we strongly believe that when the findings are regularly discussed, collaboratively interpreted, and acted upon, evaluation becomes embedded in the leadership practice. Next slide, please. All right, so you're almost towards the end. So this is the project and evaluation activities at a glance. Again, this is all from the guidebook, so you can actually lift it. So this summary table actually is from the chapter 4 of the guidebook. Year 0, readiness. Year 1 to 2, formative. Year 3, midpoint summative. Years 4 and 5, intermediate summative. And year 5, the final summative. So the arc is one of that of progressive evaluation and maturation. Early evaluation is also diagnostic. Keep in mind, it is providing feedback, and it also documents some good practices from the field, right? So no year really exists in isolation. They are informing each other. Each builds on the previous one. And please use this table at the start of your grant year to align the PI expectations along with how you as an evaluator want to work. All right, I think it's the last slide. From compliance to strategic asset, right? So the 5 core principles to carry forward for all of you as PIs, co-PIs, evaluators, researchers, IR folks. 1, evaluation must match the project's phase and track, which is appropriate for year 1, and it differs fundamentally from what is appropriate for, say, in years 4, 5, and 6. 2, formative and summative evaluations are not sequential. They are interlocking components of a continuous evidence cycle. 3, formative data collected early serves as the longitudinal building blocks for all the future summative analysis. So treat them with rigor from day 1. 4, summative findings are not endpoints. They reopen the loop and generate new formative action. And 5, evaluation embedded from the proposal phase becomes a strategic tool for reflection, refinement, and institutional learning. So Nina is here. She's going to shut up. So here I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. Yes, we do have some questions, and so I just want to get right into it. Tunkay asked one question for the if the same PI team had previous projects, should the present project be treated as the continuation, and hence the evaluation should contain comparison with the previous project in the annual evaluation?
So I did mention that in quite a bit of detail because we have one of those projects. So that is basically how are you kind of offboarding the previous project while you're also onboarding. So the answer is yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, next question from Kristen. We are finishing year one and welcoming our first cohort this fall. In terms of demographic data questions, we are a little skittish about getting into trouble down the road with specific questions that could be deemed DEI. It does not seem like that data could be helpful. It does seem like that data could be helpful to have. Any thoughts?
Yes, great question. So what we are trying to do here is that for NSF reporting, we do an aggregate data as to here are the scholars, freshmen, sophomore, and their majors, and we really don't delve into the race, ethnicity, and other information. What we're trying to do is we create a shorter memo for the PIs and co-PIs, which is not submitted to the NSF, and we do disaggregate data. So again, it's an understanding between you, the evaluator, and the PI co-PI. So one is a very public-facing evaluation report that is aggregated, very high level, universal, and then you have much more, minutia looking at the disaggregate data as appropriate.
Are there any other questions that people want to pose? If you want to get off and say it on online live, you can do that too. You can just raise your hand. We'll unmute you. Okay, Marilyn. Okay, go ahead and unmute.
So I was wondering, I was a little confused about because you were talking about some memos that are short, like 5 to 7 pages, and then you were talking about evaluation reports that are a little bit longer, particularly like with that year 0 and year 1, where there isn't a lot of content. I wasn't sure the distinction that you were making. And then you were also talking about NSF reports that the evaluator doesn't necessarily do. That would be the project team. So I was a little confused about how those all fit together.
Sure, no, great question. So let me actually say this. So for track 1, year 0 basically is planning year, right, Marilyn? And you're not really collecting that fundamental, like a cohort outputs or outcomes. You're just collecting very basic, how did the planning go? What is the process happening? So you really don't have much to report except that you're establishing a relationship. These tools were created and all that stuff, right? So that's why I said, yeah, a couple of pages of memo as to what really happened as an evaluator in year 1 will suffice, right? The annual report, so there is one clear distinction. One is the annual report that is completed by the PIs and co-PIs is not the same as the evaluation report. Although they are both submitted and they're attached on research.gov at the same time, the annual report is completed by the PIs and co-PIs, while the evaluation report, in our case, for track 1, we will have a proper evaluation report, meaning 10-15 pages, depending on how much data you have. Like it will have an executive summary, an introduction, your methodology about yourself. What did you collect in year 2? What did you do in year 3? So that really kind of is much more in depth, right? That's the annual evaluation report that also goes with the annual report that the PIs and co-PIs submit on research.gov. So as evaluators, we are required to complete an annual evaluation report. That's mandatory, and that needs to be submitted with the annual report that goes from the PIs and co-PIs.
So what are the short memos then? Those are like
right.
mid-year?
So that is for formative, right? So when you're collecting data, I'm saying that don't wait until the end of the year to just complete an annual evaluation report, but just complete a couple of pages of memos that we call as data summaries, right? So that you're providing formative feedback. Yeah.
Okay, and those would go to the project team.
Exactly.
Okay.
Internal feedback loop continues to corrective actions like, hey, I did a site visit or I sat through a focus group. I conducted a focus group. These are some of the things that came out, right? So you are accumulating everything across the year and then folding them into your evaluation report in the end, right? But you have these smaller things that are happening, which are helping inform the final product.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Good. Thank you.
Okay. Marisol?
Hey, Marisol.
Hi, Kavita and everyone else. Sorry, I was late because I was doing interviews actually. Do you have, I know it goes beyond maybe the focus of this talk, but do you have good examples of institutionalization, people I can't say that word,
I got it. No, I
institutionalizing
got it.
We
Yeah.
got it.
some of the
Yeah.
some of the activities, some of the best practices. I know you mentioned in passing, like, a mentoring um, program or something
Yeah.
of that kind. But do you have actual examples? Do you know of people that have been successful
Yes, not
institutionalizing?
many examples, but a few examples of the top of my head is, institutionalizing certain tutoring aspects. For instance, there was one STEM project that ended many years ago. They experimented the concept of embedded tutoring, right? They had actually tutors in the classroom, like the TAs that we used to have in grad school, and they found money outside of the STEM grant and they institutionalized embedded tutoring. The second one would also be, institutionalizing some positions. The position that was actually being supported and funded through the STEM project became a part and parcel of that particular department. They realized the importance and the value that particular position actually brings, and they said, you know what, we're going to find the money, and we're going to keep that position so that it becomes part and parcel of our department. Those are two classic examples, Marisol, and I can dig a bit more and then find out more for you if you're interested.
Thank you.
We have a question on chat from Young. What would be an appropriate page length for an external evaluator's annual evaluation report during years 4 through 6 of the project?
So generally, again, it depends on the quality of data. We cannot mandate that it has to be 10, 15 pages, 20 pages, really depends on one, how you write, how much data you have, right? So, and people just don't read. That's the fundamental problem. So keep it nice, short and sweet and get the message out. I would say that every report generally must have an executive summary because that tells you the high points. What are some of the lessons learned? What are some of the recommendations? But believe it or not, there are some program officers who will read your whole report. So I would say that 10 to 15 pages is reasonable. And so far, we have not had any complaints where they said, oh, this is too long. Yeah. I think we need to leave some time for Tara.
Yeah,
Survey.
right.
Yeah.
So we could go back to the slides, please. Yes. So please take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback's really important for making these sessions possible. And if you have any ideas about future webinars, please let us know using the survey. Next slide, please. So I want to thank Kavita again for this wonderful presentation and thank you all for participating. Please stay connected with us. You see all our ways to be in touch through website, newsletters, and social media. And with that, please take care. Enjoy the rest of the week and enjoy FIFA.